everybody. I'm Keena Melville. I'm so glad to be here. Thank you, Julie, for asking me to speak. Um, I have studied a lot about literacy and autism. I'm kind of fascinated by it. And a lot of I have a PhD in literacy, and a lot of my studies focused on literacy and autism. And as I researched more and more and worked with autistic students, I noticed the sensory differences. And there are so many different types of sensory differences that a person can have. And I focused on relating that into literacy, but I also I'm excited. I'm going to be moving to South Dakota soon to work at South Dakota State University, and I'm going to be looking into creating a program that really values sensory experiences of students and trying to create a program just to help out in the local school districts to make education a little bit more sensory friendly. When I worked at the Helix School, which I was there for about 7 years, such a great experience. And I learned so much. And something I love about that school is that all of the specialists work really closely together. So I was able to learn so much from the speech language therapist and the counselor and the occupational therapist. So I would look at my classes and try to kind of integrate all of those different therapies into language arts. So yeah, I'm going to talk a little bit about that. And I'm going to touch on sensory perceptions and interpretations, sensory variations that I've read about and have seen, and how that impacts the interpretations. And then how that ties into reading comprehension and sensory perception. I have noticed when in my practice and also in some of the research that I've done, concrete thinkers often gravitate towards nonfiction text. So, but there is so much opportunity to learn about the world in fiction text. So that's mainly what I'm talking about when I'm talking about reading comprehension. I'm talking about of fiction text because there's a lot of nuances that are easily missed when somebody might be reading that. My objectives for today that I would love for you to walk away with, being able to describe at least 2 exceptional variations of sensory processing. Name 2 ways this can hinder comprehension, and learn 2 sensory-based strategies to enhance comprehension. It goes so much more beyond comprehension, though. When we're talking about fiction literature, it's also helpful for world knowledge, really. I put some quotes within my presentation because I wanted to include autistic voices and also researchers. So this one, everything we know about the world and ourselves has come through our senses. All our knowledge, therefore, is the product of what we have seen, heard, smelled, etc. The process by which an organism collects, interprets, and comprehends information from the outside world by means of senses is called perception. So we have that perception, but it starts out as a sensation. And the sensation is then interpreted into how they perceive the world. And that can include the quality, the intensity, and the duration of certain sensations. And I know Kelly talked about earlier the sensations in your body and what that might feel like and where it might be located in your body. And from there, how does that connect to your emotions and your feelings? And then going even further, how could you use a tool to change that feeling or support that feeling? Okay, so I'm going to dive in a little bit more about sensation. There could be the representative sensation of your senses: taste, touch, smell, heat. So there's a stimulus, and let's say the stimulus is a water bottle. The sensation, what you're feeling in that water bottle, is cold, it's hard, and it's a plastic thing. A possible interpretation of that is that's a water bottle. And you can comprehend or understand that by knowing that I can drink water. And then we also have sensation affective, like pleasure and pain. So let's say the stimulus is a trampoline. We can feel on the trampoline that it's stretchy fabric, cold metal bars, and it's bouncy. And our interpretation or perception, that's a trampoline, and I can jump on it and feel happy. In some neurodivergent folks, there can be sensory perception variations. And this, I find this very interesting, and I have seen it where senses, what they're perceiving, can sometimes overlap. Sometimes you feel different senses. I was reading earlier, and somebody was talking about, an autistic person was talking about feeling colors and being able to kind of become the color. And it's just very, very interesting stuff. So certain things can happen with sensory perceptions, like sensory overload. So there are different types of sensory receptors, and in the brain, there are these mini columns, and in maybe a neurotypical person, those columns are a certain height. I have read that for certain autistic people, maybe their columns are a little bit shorter, and that's where we're receiving our sensory information. So in the taller ones, we may be able to filter it out a little bit more or keep them in their containers. And with the mini columns, it sometimes can overlap, like I was talking about earlier. So if you can't filter out certain sensory stimuli, then that could lead to overload, overwhelm, and maybe the compensation for that is to shut down. There's also something that is difficulty or inability to stop feeling the change. So let's say you get scratched. If I got scratched, I normally would say ow, and then I'm fine. But some people can't stop feeling that scratch, or it takes a lot longer for them to let go of that sensation. Then there's hyper or hyposensitivity to certain things. So somebody may be seeking it and really trying to get input from a certain sense, or they may be totally averse to it and do everything they can to avoid it. There's also sensory fascination. So that was kind of what I was talking about a little while ago, where the person was actually becoming the color and really being absorbed. I also have heard of people like smelling colors, or there are different ways that it can overlap. So that would be the synesthesia piece, where there's just yeah, there's a lot of overlap, and also there might be a fascination. So somebody might be gravitating towards one of those sensory experiences that they are just totally fascinated by. There can also be fragmented perception. With fragmented perception, they may be seeing bits and pieces of different stimuli, and then that could lead to challenges with seeing the big picture of things and having all of the little details kind of relating to each other and adding up to a bigger picture, but they might be just looking at the little details and not seeing the connection. There's also difficulty interpreting the sense. So they could possibly shut down that sense if they can't interpret it. So maybe they're really involved with smelling something, but then they can't feel. Like if you touch them, they might shut that sensory receptor down. Sensory intolerance. There's also sometimes delayed or distorted perception. I once had a student that I asked them a question and I didn't think that they answered it, but then 24 hours later, he had an answer for me when we went back to school that following day. It was amazing. So just giving people time to process, because that happens at different times for different people. And then there's literal perception, which really comes into play with fiction text, and foreground and background discernment. So sometimes it's not obvious what is in the background and what is right in front of you. So alternative perceptions, some neurodivergent people may skip these sensation stages. Some autistic individuals report that their visual discrimination does not allow them to see the gestalt or that big picture. They may see the bits and pieces first, and that might be the most prominent. The fragments may not fit together for them. They may need to be taught how to piece it together and also how to attach meaning to what they're seeing. So this is an autistic person explaining their literal perception. Most things I take at face value without judging or interpreting them. I look at them in a concrete, literal, and very individual way. I do not normally integrate things or see them as connected unless I actively look for a connection. And of course, when I'm having quotes up here and when we're hearing from autistic individuals, it's also important to consider people who might be nonverbal, having completely different experiences that they can't explain to us. And that's where observation and just really looking at the individual, because everybody is completely different, especially autistic or neurodivergent people. They might be like, it's really important to look at the individual and how they're reacting to the world around them. And then another quote, it was like having a brain with no sieve. So that an autistic person explaining their inability to distinguish foreground and background information. This is somebody else talking about fragmented perception. I picked up his hand and looked at it closely. I traced it with my eyes from the fingers to the shoulder, from the shoulder to the eyes, down to the toes and mouth. Ian was a jigsaw of bits that my mind was in no state to make sense of as a whole. And then, so if the perceptual processes are functioning appropriately, infants are able to make sense of the environment. I meant to say are. On the other hand, distorted sensory input becomes distorted information. And then I just put in here, who's to say my perception is the correct one, as with this quote. I like that. I think we are shifting from weaknesses to strength-based and neurodiversity affirming beliefs, but it is still definitely deficit focused from the research in the past. So I have seen autistic people that I look at them and I'm like, I would love to be in their world. Like that looks like way more fun. And then we have these perceptual styles that go along with the sensory information. So neurodivergent folks may compensate for sensory variations through their perception style. So monoprocessing could be, I'm only going to process information through one sense at a time, and all the other senses just are shut down at the moment. That's when somebody might only have, only are able to see, but they're not hearing anything or feeling anything. And then maybe they switch, or maybe that's just their dominant way of viewing the world. And then there could be peripheral perception. So that would be, it's too direct to look at things straight on. So I'm just going to view stuff from the side and interpret what I can. And then there's compensation for an unreliable sense by the other sense. Resonance, that's what I was talking about earlier about like the person becoming the colors. So that could happen with any sense where the person is fascinated with maybe something that they're feeling in their hands, and maybe they're so involved with that there's nothing else going on sensory wise for that person. And then daydreaming can also be a compensation strategy. So this all sounds kind of complicated. What makes the matter even more complicated is that no two autistic people appear to have exactly the same patterns of sensory perceptual experiences. So it is important to look at everybody as an individual and come up with them, if possible, what they need from what their experience is. I don't think we have time to take 5 minutes, but maybe you can write down or talk or think or draw 2 sensory variations that stuck out to you. So I'll give you like a minute maybe to just think about if you can, if you found any of those 2 interesting or if anything resonated with you. I'll also go back. Okay. So, and I want to talk about how this all relates to reading comprehension. It relates to so much about the world, but I'm focusing on reading comprehension. So what is reading comprehension? So simply put, it's the process of making meaning while reading. It's basically the only reason to read. And this is just a national statistic. Only 31% of 4th grade students could interpret a descriptive phrase on the basically the nation's report card. So reading comprehension is something that I think will be getting more attention in the future because it's needed in so many ways, but especially for students that I've worked with that are neurodivergent in some way. These are factors that contribute to reading comprehension. So decoding words. So that's just the act of reading the words, phonics type of thing. I've seen a lot of autistic students that are hyperlexic. So they may have cracked the code of how to read, but then they're not understanding the meaning behind the words. There's also language comprehension. Do they understand the words in speech? And that is also a part of reading comprehension. Then what I want to talk about is sensory experiences and background knowledge and how that contributes to reading comprehension, because those are huge factors for everybody in interpreting fiction text. And then social emotional understanding. and then psychological and experiential factors as well. So all of these things contribute to reading comprehension. And so what is background knowledge? This is the knowledge that the reader has already so that they can draw upon that and connect to the story. So your background knowledge can be drawn from vocabulary, from your world knowledge, interpersonal knowledge, sensory experiences, and perceptions. There's a lot of research that talks about how important background knowledge is for anybody who's reading. There was a test done recently where they gave students a reading comprehension test, and one of the groups got a text that they were well versed in background knowledge of that text. I think it was a sport. So, and then the other test was actually higher readers, but they didn't have any background knowledge to the topic. And the readers that did the best were the ones that had the background knowledge of that sport to be able to understand the text. So that comes into play, and background knowledge can come from anywhere. It's just your experiences. It could be travel, cultures, community operations, emotions, etiquette, body language, animals, activities, could be anything. So you're just gathering, it's basically just your prior knowledge about the world. So I have two examples here of what could be a possible interpretation, or two possible interpretations of two different things. So let's say we're talking about world knowledge and we're talking about birthday parties. So somebody might have the experience at a birthday party of their friends playing and that there's cake and games and they're fun. Somebody else might experience birthday parties completely differently. They might be focused on the details, the routine, multiple people talking. Maybe they have synesthesia. I spelled that wrong. The cake tastes and sounds a certain way, maybe. So there's a different perception of cake. There's a different perception of the structure of the party. And maybe they're doing some compensation and tuning out the noise and the people. So if an author is writing something about birthday parties, the person who has the cake and games and background knowledge will probably understand what that author is talking about, and vice versa. And then we have emotional background knowledge. So let's say we're talking about the grocery store. My background knowledge might be there might be a long line, impatience. Maybe there's some combativeness at the grocery store. Somebody else's interpretation might be sensory overload or fragmented perception. And in that case, what the grocery store means to me is that I panic. And maybe I'm just focusing on one sense at a time. So maybe I'm focusing on the textures in the store. So then I have no idea about the long lines and the impatience. So this is something I just came up with where I was thinking about the possible fiction reading cycle for some neurodivergent individuals. So they'll have their sensory input, which will translate to the perception and then translate to the interpretation, just like the grocery store or the birthday party. Then they read something. The author is describing a situation unlike what that person's experiencing, which means they can't relate to the story. They might not then enjoy or understand fiction. They might also become aware that they are different. And then reading can contribute to feelings of isolation or confusion. And then I just am posing this question: could reading fiction text be similar to reading a book in a different language? As in, you may be able to pronounce the words, but they don't hold meaning. So yes, it's important to learn how each individual autistic person's senses function That's a key way to understanding that person and how they interpret or perceive the world around them. So that's really important in educational settings, but I think in all settings. I think I'll skip this, but I do want you to think about, I would love for you to walk away with thinking about 2 sensory variations that might complicate reading comprehension or world comprehension. And think about if you know anybody that might be true for. Okay, so now I'm going to shift to using sensory strengths to boost comprehension. So I look at if a student has a sensory strength or they gravitate towards a certain sense, that's it could be something that pulls them into the story. If you kind of translate the story a little bit involving that sense that is predominant to them. So these are just ways that you can translate the story through the senses. So lots of images are a good way to go, and incorporating social emotional learning. So making the book visual and breaking down concepts to explicitly note what is happening in the plot and between the characters. I think that fiction text is a huge opportunity to learn about the world. And if you make the characters kind of, what I like to do is try to form a relationship between the character and the student. And then they're more invested in the social dynamics of what is happening between those characters. Okay, movement, number 2. So move the body to increase engagement, provide sensory input, and act out scenes from the story to increase arousal and just engagement overall. So I have some examples to show you after this of all of these, but number 3, olfactory. So aromatherapy can help with alertness, calming, etc. It's easy and quick to add into any lesson. Of course, that not all of these would work for everybody. So that's why it's important to know the student. I've had students in the same room that their sensory preferences might trigger another student's maybe what the sense that they're avoiding. So I would, of course, look at the individuals, see how this stuff can fit in. For background versus foreground, so a student might experience an inability to filter through incoming information and details. So simplifying the language in the book in order to make the bigger ideas stick out might be helpful, and omitting irrelevant language. I also am super interested in and hope to research one day having autistic authors like implanting minor details into text that that might increase comprehension. If that's what a student might be focused on, the minor details, then they should also be seeing themselves in literature and what's important to them. Okay, 5, fragmented perception. So when a person sees bits of everything, people, objects, etc., it might be helpful to omit a lot of the language, write shorter sentences and add visuals in. 6, literal perception. So critical thinking exercises in the book might help with processing information, cause and effect, social emotional inference making, and graphic organizers to help classify information can all help with reading comprehension. This is just, I have some examples of what I've done to a book. So this book is Hello Universe. It's about a 5th grade novel. And so there's no visuals in it, and there's a lot of language in it that is confusing or was confusing to some of my students. So what I've done is added in some of the visuals and then made thought bubbles for when the character is thinking something. And then I try to explain what that is. So this is Virgil, our character, and he was thinking, I'm no good at gym. I'm always picked last. I am a grand failure. I'm so quiet that my family calls me Turtle because I don't come out of my shell. I do not like being called Turtle. So just kind of making it a little bit more clear what the overall message of that page was. And then also wanting to take that opportunity to explain this is negative self-talk when you say defeating things in your head about yourself. And then we can talk about positive thought. Here's a quote from Temple Grandin. Children are different. Parents should identify which way their child learns best and then use that method. So yes, and this is an example of simplifying the concept, making the book visual, explicitly stating what is happening and parsing through the major versus minor details. And then, so this is the next page when I'm talking about positive self-talk, just taking that opportunity to kind of help the students see both sides, but it can also help them in their actual worlds. So positive self-talk, I am really dedicated. I practice a lot and I'm getting better at gym class. I can, and then the students will fill in the blank of what Virgil could do. And maybe that would help Virgil and how he feels about himself. Also in this text, there was an example, I think the author wrote, Virgil walked into the house like a defeated athlete. So sometimes autistic students or concrete thinkers in general might not know what that means. So body language gives clues about how people feel. Sometimes that's missed. So how does the first player feel compared to the second player? And then you see the first player here, he's looking down and not smiling. And then the second player is looking up and smiling. And his shoulders are up and his arms are up. So then the student can maybe pick out which one Virgil is feeling like and what that might translate to how that character feels. So this also getting them critically thinking about the text is important to help them get involved. So so this is one of the characters, Valencia, she's on top and she's thinking, I have to figure things like this out constantly because I can't hear what they say. Thanks for trying it out. So Valencia in this book happened to be hearing impaired. So she had to look at body language and gestural cues in order to figure out what was going on with people. So then I would have the students kind of connect those pictures to the circles of, okay, that person's looking at the watch on his hand. So they're probably thinking the time is. So this would be an example of breaking it down and activating problem solving and critical thinking in order to connect deeper to the text. Here we're comparing Valencia's reaction to seeing the town bully in the grocery store. And so this is just helping them kind of use neutral emojis to connect with maybe how the character might be feeling. And then also putting little scripts into the text as well. I was calling these micro theater, where maybe you're just acting out to get the child up, and also learning social emotional concepts by having a script and practicing in dialogue. And I have seen such joy with students acting things out, and I have also seen joy in students having a script, because sometimes it makes it a little bit easier to have the words in front of you, knowing what to say. And this is just a graphic organizer where, so in the book, it's just a regular, like 300-page novel. And in a few chapters, we were talking about these characters and how they feel at the grocery store. So just breaking it down and asking the child, you're stopping the text so it's not overwhelming information, but you're also having them process what's happening in the story on the paper. So how does Valencia feel at the grocery store? How does Chet feel? How does Virgil feel? And that will help them to comprehend the text. So the best way to teach this emotional concept is to take a variety of reading materials and step-by-step explain how to determine emotional content. That's by Temple Grandin. Okay, and here are some hands-on examples of what you can do to stories. You can make them, bring them to life. When you bring the stories to life, they connect more with the book. They also might get bored of the book eventually. I have had that happen. But yeah, anything to bring the book alive. So in the middle, we have a student who is making a geode out of the eggshell, because in that same book, there was a lot of rocks and gemstones and geodes, and as we're doing the activities, we're talking about the book. So it's another way to bring them in. Movement, so just printing out some of the pages, putting them on the ground, the student can sequence and yeah, just kind of absorb the information in a different way with the visuals and the sequencing and reading the story. And they feel more connected to, well, it's my interpretation that they feel more connected to the characters in that way. So visual, so I have different senses, different ways that you can approach learning. So visual thinkers thrive with visual information like charts, diagrams, and pictures. Supplementing reading material with visuals enhances their comprehension and memory. And then you can always, what I like to do is do the modification of the book, but then go back to the book and maybe highlight a couple of the paragraphs that were important. So you're also including the book in the modification and not. And then we have tactile learners that learn best through touch and hands-on experiences. So providing textured reading materials or incorporating manipulatives related to the text engages their sense of touch, deepening their understanding. Then we have kinesthetic learners, and they benefit from movement and physical activity, so allowing them to move while reading, such as using a therapy ball or acting out parts of the story, can improve focus and comprehension. Then there's auditory learners that excel with sound and oral instruction. You can read aloud, play, or create music, use an audiobook, or engage in group discussion, and that can help them process the content. And then I just have 4 ways to move during reading class. So you can lay out. So this was inspired by my work at Helix, because I remember having the perspective of the occupational therapist. And I remember just trying, because I know this works, to incorporate the movement and incorporate these creative ideas to bring the story to life. So laying out hula hoops and having different text passages in each hoop. Students can balance on one foot outside of the hoop to pick up the text. They can identify the genre, hula hoop for 20 seconds, and then move on to the next. They can act out the passage so that they reread and rehearse. Rereading in general increases comprehension, and it's a great thing. So this is another way, a creative way to get them to reread if they're going to rehearse and then perform it. Also doing downward dogs and other yoga stretches while reading. The book can be placed on the floor and they can read while in the position if it's comfortable for them. And then for foundational skills, you can make Elkin boxes with masking tape or sidewalk chalk on the floor. That's just when you're putting, Elkin boxes are squares that you'd have different letters in, and then the student sounds out each letter and then kind of puts the word together, but you can definitely do this on the ground. It doesn't have to be on a piece of paper. So as kids sound out sounds, they can hop from one box to the next. And then, yeah, my conclusions for this, and this is going to be like a living presentation because there's so much more that I would like to research and add to it. But conclusion, every autistic individual is different. So finding out who they are, how they perceive the world, and how they learn is crucial to helping them understand. And then conclusion 2, just to make learning multidimensional, just like humans are. So there's something called universal design for learning, and universal design for learning incorporates all the different representations that might be useful for different people with different brains. I mean, we all have different brains. So universal design for learning is just best practice for teaching, but it's also a good outline of how you can bring it to the next level, even for neurodivergent students. So yeah, that's my presentation. And let me know if you have any questions.
Schooling curriculums that take what you just shared into consideration for families who school their children?
I have done some research around homeschooling neurodivergent students because I was actually interested in doing that myself, and I didn't find anything. Yeah, I did not find anything that that was that great. So anything that I found, I would have to modify still. Yeah, great question though.
So mine is not so much a question. My daughter is 21, but she is hyperlexic, so she was reading the sheets too. And so there was a couple of observations. It's interesting to put structure and put things in buckets with her. She was fearless in reading. The decoding part she had, it was hard when she decided how to pronounce the word to get her to pronounce it correctly. But as far as reading comprehension being the only reason to read, that's not true. Hers was just the true joy of reading words, not so much sentences, words. And you have movement up there. Hers was credits. So there's no comprehension in reading names. She loved it. And she was glued to the TV. So there's movement of the body, but there's movement of words. In her case, it was like addictive. If words were moving on the screen, and she'd make us play credits over again. It's so funny. But with her, we had troubles moving from word reading. She tended to go to the last page of the book, the last word on the paragraph. She'd skip articles. She likes nouns and things, or maybe verbs. And so getting her to put it together for us was challenging. But she was very auditory, so we read to her. She loved that. I mean, she's not the credits, but she doesn't. But the way to most engage her was using voices. So we Sesame Street books. Okay, so we got really good at doing voices and being really energetic, and sometimes it would stop to describe what was going on. So emotions were difficult concepts for her. So just trying to tie it back to something she'd experienced. So we'd stop reading, books that more than just words on each page. But is there any tricks to helping her bridge from word reading to actually paragraph comprehension.
Thank you for your comments. And I love that piece about the text moving. That's awesome. So what I have found helpful, and then this is actually Linda Mood Bell, Visualizing Verbalizing, but if you read sentence by sentence and ask them, so read one sentence, stop, ask them what color they're picturing. I mean, depending on the sentence, you can ask them all these different kinds of questions to help help them actually visualize the story or the paragraph. And yeah, I think you can ask about, I mean, you can ask about anything, but yeah, what color are you seeing? How many are you seeing? What color hair does that person have? What are they wearing? And so I like to move it a little bit forward and also you can ask them to draw it. Let's draw just those same questions, but they're drawing it out. So you're actually creating the visual, which would be easier maybe to absorb. And then you can do that sentence by sentence. According to Linda Mood Bell, you wouldn't have to do that for every single sentence eventually. And that's just helping the visualization process. And okay, so that's one answer for that. And then, yeah, I guess some of what I did in the presentation, you could do it doesn't have to be fiction text, but just bringing in more visuals, asking those critical thinking questions, because the process of answering a critical thinking question is going to have them thinking deeper than just the words. Yeah, I think there's a variety of ways that you could do it. I could probably talk for hours about that, so I'll meet you after.
So I understand that which strategy would work will be different child by child. What do you think, or what kind of factors do you think will be affecting such diversity? Like, for example, for boys, this tend to work, or for girls, this tend to work, or for this kind of kids, this tend to work, or this kind of kid, this tend to work. That's kind of, I want to hear any ideas.
Yeah, great question. So definitely each individual is different, and looking at them and coming up with a sensory and learning profile. If you can't do that individually, I would just look at the individuals that are in the group, and you can identify the groups kind of, how they might process information. You can look at what do they have in common in your observations for how they process information, and definitely take into account any aversion, so that you're not bringing that into the setting. I feel like if it's neutral kind of sensory experiences, then even if it's not somebody's preference, they can tolerate it and maybe experience it. So yeah, I think I don't have like a girls this way, boys this way. A lot of times there are co-occurring diagnoses. And so if somebody has, like let's say autism and ADHD, then depending on how they express their ADHD, but maybe there's a lot more movement in that class. So yeah, it's really tough. I struggle with this as a teacher when you have a lot of students unless you don't sleep and all of your time is looking at each individual student, is very, it's a challenge to figure out exactly the right kind of recipe to meet them all where they're at. But I think just having the intention there, and I am a big fan of sensory and learning profiles of the students. You can kind of assess them, see where they're at, and then at least you have the paperwork to look at afterwards, like, oh, they have this in common. This is the most kind of common maybe learning style in the room, and then you concentrate on that. So I hope that answered your question, but it's almost an impossible question to answer, in my opinion. I don't know.
So I have an observation that I just thought was interesting. So we don't have any neurotypical people in my family. We're all over the place, but we read excessively. I don't know if you know this, but if you have over 1,000 books in your house, you're considered a library. So I'm a librarian. Very exciting. But I grew up in a house where we were not allowed to read any magic. Because my parents were religious believers from the table, and I grew up really hating fiction because I didn't see a point. But now we read and listen to magic 24/7. And I'm wondering if some of that is because we don't have the same rules around visualizing when it's magic. So if somebody says they flew through the air, that's a really hard concept for a lot of my kids.
Mm-hmm.
But if you say they flew through the air and there's magic, well, then they can literally be flying through the air. Or if we're reading about volcanoes, you're supposed to visualize it exactly like the actual volcano looks like. But if I'm visualizing an elf, well, then there's lots of ways that an elf can work. And so I'm wondering if there's a piece that maybe, especially when we're talking visualizations, it can be helpful to do things where there's permission for a lot of different ways for that to be.
I love that. Yes, because that, I think magic is a great avenue to go when you're talking about, because yes, they have a concept of it and it is out of the normal magic. So it might be easier to kind of make sense of what's happening. So yeah, that's an awesome observation, and thank you.
All right.
What about, have you ever worked with kids to help them read poetry? I know my little sister with PCH 19, she's really good at memorizing poems. Like she can memorize like long poems, easy peasy for her. And she loves it. She loves like the sound of the poetry, like the rhyming sound of the poetry.
Yes, that's fantastic. I think that's great. And I have taught poetry, and I think it's a really good avenue to talk about literary devices, and that can be confusing. You can, yeah, talk about the rhythm and the rhyming and the just if you're expressing words in a certain way that are powerful, you know, onomatopoeias and all that. I think it's really great to use poetry for that reason, because you're learning all of these different literary devices that are used in other literature. And then, yes, it is kind of chunked text. So it's not as overwhelming maybe as a page full of text. And yeah, I think poetry is a great way to also practice prosody and just rereading, but then also visualizing, because you can draw what's going on there, you can picture what's going on there, and just like the magic, you know, a lot of times poems don't literally mean what they're saying. So you're practicing figurative language, and maybe saying poems are magic is a way to help certain students kind of work with idioms and similes and things like that. yeah, so that's awesome. And does your, is it your daughter or your niece? Sister, sorry. And she's comprehending the whole? Yeah, cool. That's, yeah, that's fantastic. Sounds like a super ability.
Awesome, thanks, Keena. Appreciate it.
Thank you.